It's great to be here tonight. You may be wondering from my profile, why is a guy with a background in classics and comparative Semitic languages talking about bioethics? It's because over about the 8 years or so of my graduate experience, my area of focus was philosophy and linguistics and religion and the occult. And quite frankly, when we look at what's going on from the science and tech space, on this topic, the most compelling questions are actually on the philosophical side. And so this is a topic that specifically for the last 3 years with my company, I've been doing a lot of speaking at the post-secondary level on what's going on as we look at how we prepare the U.S. workforce for the world that technology is changing. And we're going to spend some time talking about that tonight. Before we dive in, though, there is a handout on your table. And so what I did is I compiled just a real quick list of resources. We can only cover so much tonight. This really could be like a 2-semester course. But if there are 5 books that you wanted to look at, there are a few here. And I will say most of these are not simple reads. But Robert George up at Princeton has a great book. It's a bit dated, but on natural law. The fundamental issue that we're dealing with on these issues really boils down to a natural law question. And this is the definitive work on natural law. Thomas Leonard, this is a book that just came out from Princeton last year, wrote a book called Illiberal Reformers, Race, Eugenics, and American Economics in the Progressive Era. If you want to see what happens to a society when the argument from the Christian perspective leaves the public square, this book will give you the story. Now, as far as I know, Thomas is not a believer, but a very compelling story as to what happens when our argument goes away. The best book from a biblical perspective in terms of anthropology is by J.P. Moreland. It's pretty intense. If you have no background in philosophy, don't start with that book. But it is small. It's only like 150 pages. Michael Snyder, this is the one book that I always recommend for Christians to read. Snyder's a professor at Stanford Med School. I've been doing a lot of work with them through the years. Snyder is not a believer. But the reason why I recommend his book is it just came out. It came out right at the end of last year. So if you're interested in genomics, this is the most authoritative book treatment in terms of what's going on. And I also like to recommend it to Christians because the way in which he writes about the implications of what's going on with the technology, if it doesn't make your skin crawl, there's something wrong with you. And I think a lot of people just simply don't realize where the game is at right now, and that's partially what we want to do. And this is written for non-scientific people. So if science is not your game, you can read this literally watching, the Nats play, in probably 8 innings or less. Weichert's got a new book called The Death of Humanity and the Case for Life. Weichert's more important book, which really was the publication of his PhD dissertation about 15 years ago, called From Darwin to Hitler, Race, Eugenics, and Nazi Germany, was one of the best books that have probably come out in a long time on the issue of anthropology in Europe. But those are 5 books that will help give you the background for dealing with what we're talking about. 5 thought leaders. So Nigel Cameron, how many of you are familiar with Nigel? Nigel's a believer. I believe he comes from the Anglican background, but he's based in D.C. He started the Center for Policy on Emerging Tech. Super good guy. Runs several speaking sessions in D.C. He's a great guy to go here if you get a chance. Robert George, of course, is at Princeton. Most of you have probably heard of George. Jim Giordano, Jim's a friend of mine. I actually asked him to sit on my board a couple years ago, purposely to advise me on some of these issues tied into bioethics. Jim is a neuroscientist. He's at Georgetown. He's also the new senior science advisor for the Pentagon and Department of Defense, where he's advising them on cyborg technology, and that's all he's allowed to tell me. So, but some really interesting things going on in that space. By the way, Jim also just became a senior fellow at CPET. And so if you go to CPET's website, in February, Nigel conducted an interview with Jim on what's emerging in the neuroscience space. And it take you like 20 minutes to read through the interview, but it is one of the most compelling interviews in terms of what's going on. So if you're interested in kind of the neuroscience space, that's a great read. Peter Singer, most of you are probably familiar with him as well. He would be the exact opposite of Robert George, right? He's also at Princeton. Singer, though, is what I like about Singer is he's completely honest. And so if you start from his presuppositions, which are very humanistic, he's completely transparent and truthful, where this should lead us, all right? And so if you want to see where kind of the avant-garde thinking on the progressive side of bioethics is, Singer's the guy to read. Craig, actually I ran into Craig at a mixer a few weeks ago up in New York City. Craig is probably really the guy right now in the US in terms of the application of genomics. You see some of the companies that he's founded. Craig is the guy that led the second team to getting, and there's some debate as to whether he came in second place or not, but the second team to actually map the human genome. And he was actually the first, him and his team, to actually use synthetic chromosomes to rebuild the human embryo. So he's done some really impressive work. We can debate as to whether the work should be done or not, but Craig is definitely one of the thought leaders in this space. The last 5 here are just some resources. So CPET, this is Nigel's group. Trinity International University does maintain a Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity, but it's dated. Most of the resources that you're going to find there are going to be between 2007 and 2012. And 2012 is important because the Milosevic research on human cloning, which had the big breakthrough in 2013, is obviously not captured in their data. But if you're looking for a Christian resource site, it's a bit dated, but that's a good place. A lot of the big stuff actually going on right now from the tech side, cloning and genomics, while there's certainly a lot to do there, has kind of a little bit kind of gone by the bar just a bit. And now the neuroscience, neuroethics, all that is really the big deal. So the DARPA Brain Initiative is probably one of the best things to look at if you're interested in that. If you're looking for a one-stop biomed Judeo-Christian resource, the Ethics in Med Journal would be the place to go. This is a very broad Christendom perspective, so Catholics, Anglicans, Jews, etc., all write and publish in this journal. But if you want to stay up on what's going on, that from a Judeo-Christian perspective, that's probably your best resource here. You're not going to find a lot of books like Snyder's book because the technology is moving so fast that books literally can't keep up. The journals are going to be your best resource. I was doing some work with the deans of the Stanford Med School this spring, and one of the things that they shared with me is they're reevaluating their entire 3-year medical degree program because the technology is moving so fast that what the students learn as first-year med students is out of date by the time they start their third year. And so the same thing is going on with a lot of things we're going to talk about tonight. And then actually the largest bioethics research library in the world is right here in DC at Georgetown. And Jim Giordano, a lot of his work is certainly stored there as well. But this is, if there's nothing else you take away from tonight, and hopefully there will be something of value, but this at least gives you a place to start. I had mentioned that I'd ran into Craig a few weeks ago at a mixer in New York, and for about the last 5 to 10 years, I've been really perplexed by a couple important questions with the type of work that I get to do around the country. And this mixer in New York City, it was called by the New York Academy of Sciences. Those of you who are in the science realm certainly recognize who they are. They are the leading science authority in this country, and certainly probably one of the top 5 institutions around the world. And it was a unique gathering of about 200 people. We probably had 15 to 20 Nobel Prize winners there. You had the Blogovitz winner there. You had CEO of PepsiCo. Craig was there. And so these are the kind of people that you get to mingle with and talk about. You had the little side group that was talking string theory in this corner. You had the side group over here talking about genomics. And 2 questions, when I leave events like that is, number 1, where are the Christians? And then number 2, why aren't these conversations happening inside the church? And I think those are really big questions that we want to explore a little bit tonight. We're behind. In some sense, we're not even in the game right now. And I think what I want to try to accomplish tonight is give a sense on where the game is at, and then how might we get back into the game in terms of influencing this space for Christ. So I think we're going to take questions at the end, so if something comes up, note it down, and I'll do my best to, if I can't answer the question for you, I will point you in the right direction. All right, so I hope you guys can read this. I mean, the font size is pretty small. All right, but when we talk about what's taking us to 2030, and I picked that date because the big mixer in New York City was called Challenge 2030. What are the issues that the scientific community needs to solve in about the next 15 years? Certainly on the pure bioethics front, genomics, cloning, synthetic bio, xenotransplantation, those are probably the big four. We're actually going to spend a little bit more detailed time talking about that tonight. On the trans-tech side, so this is where we are merging what is sometimes called the hybrid hypothesis. And if you ever run into Jim Giordano, just ask him and he'll spend 3 hours talking your ear off about the hybrid hypothesis. But this is basically creating an interface between the human machine, if you will, and the non-human machine. So how do you wire the human brain and computers together to create some type of, perhaps a cyborg? But this is where the neurospace falls. On the geopolitical side, what a lot of people don't realize is most of the funding right now, and we'll talk about some of the companies that are cropping up, are actually being funded on the private side. Lots of dollars changing hands. We'll talk about a couple companies that have raised significant millions just this year alone. But the Beijing Genomic Institute, you may not have heard of them. They are now the largest genomic research institution in the world. The United States in the last 5 years has not just fallen behind, we've been lapped. In the last 3 years, this is one of the big untold stories you won't find in the Washington Post, but 80,000 Western-educated Chinese national PhDs have gone back to China to work in groups like this. They're on the cutting edge now, and that has certain implications for how we deal with genomic policy in this country specifically, because we're already in a situation where the technology is years in front of the moral philosophy. We don't have enough regulations to really kind of rein things in. And now that we're substantially behind the Chinese, the willingness to agree to some subset of rules will be largely frowned upon. So it's very important what's going on in the international space, and they're extremely well funded. Most of the research institutions that have cropped up in the last 3-4 years in the US are raising tens of millions of dollars. Whereas in Beijing, these guys are getting billions of dollars of cheap grants from the Chinese government. One of the pillars of the Chinese Communist Party that they've announced for the 21st century pillars is in genomics. One of the goals that they have set is with the current generation of Chinese children, every one of them will have their genetic profile mapped. And so when you think about what that means, there's a lot of concern in the US and Western Europe about where we go from here. Certainly there's a lot of military stuff. We probably won't get into a lot of that tonight. Federal funding, so if there's federal funding involved, if you get federal funding, you're going to get federal morality as well. I think if we look at what's going on with some of the case decisions, you'll know what I mean. There's a huge debate going on right now. So Oxford released their big robots report last month. If you follow Elon Musk on Twitter, all right, all of Musk's tweets for literally like the last month have all been from this report. But robot law has now become a new field of study. And there's a great piece out by Horst Eidenmuller from Oxford exploring how we need to think about robot law and what this means in terms of personhood, et cetera. Moral status, so for those of you non-philosophers out there, moral status has historically been applied to a moral agent. And we can debate what a moral agent is, but moral status is now being applied to things like machine learning, to AI, to all these sorts of things as well. And so where we wind up on that debate is going to be very intriguing. And this is kind of where you get into this inanimate personhood. What actually is a person? And when we come wrap things up tonight, we'll kind of go. This is kind of a big picture, and one of my favorite Chesterton quotes is, we are in ever greater need of somebody like Francis to convert the Christians to Christianity. In all these meetings with provosts and deans and faculty and the labs I go to and mixer events like up in New York City, we're not there. The biblical anthropological argument is largely missing from these cases, and the light is not pushing back the darkness. I think that is the central concern that I find as I leave these types of meetings. I want to give you one philosophical law to start with as we think about all the, in some sense, crazy things we're going to touch on tonight. But every distinct view of the universe, every theory about nature necessarily entails a view of morality, and every distinct view of morality, every theory about human nature necessarily entails a cosmology to support it. We're not just simply talking about value-free science. All right, that's not the point here. And I can tell you that the scientific thinkers like Craig and Jim and et cetera, when we talk at these mixers, they completely agree. All right, they recognize that there are deep moral, philosophical, and cosmological presuppositions and implications that underlie the research that's taking place. All right, so we are talking about a value-based argument that's being created, but only one side of the room is currently doing the talking. So I want to talk just very quickly. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this section. It's more so just to paint a picture of what's going on right now. Depending on who you read or what you might read, the keyword's disruption. All right. Between now and about 2025 is supposed to be one of the most disruptive periods in the history of the world. Probably even worse so than the Industrial Revolution back at the start of the 18th century. All right. We're looking for significant change, and you see some of those things. Business status quo is going to change. The way people work and live is going to change. This third point, values and ethics are being completely questioned across the board based on what we can now do with technology. I don't know if you guys read Yuval Noah Harari. He's teaching at Hebrew University now, but his new book that just came out is called Homo Deus, all right? The God Man, all right? And this is his history of the future. Just the title alone kind of clues you into kind of where he's going here. But there's a whole argument taking place outside in some of these great campuses, and truthfully, there's a lot of confusion, all right? Even the people that I meet with at some of the top schools around the country, they are confused and as concerned as we as Christians might be in terms of what's going on. So it's not so much that our arguments are being defeated, it's just that we're not in the game. A lot of times when I speak on disruption, people have a hard time picturing what it is. This is what it is. So this is Shanghai in 97. This is Shanghai 10 years later. All right, this is what we mean by disruption. This change has happened in over 200 cities in China in the last 10 to 15 years alone. All right, so when you think about what's required here to what's required here, there's significant impact in terms of economics and geopolitics and morality and ethics, and the pace is fast. The pace is great. And we have not yet even written the rules to control the pace that took place yesterday. And so when we talk about disruption, I want to quickly just hit 5 big things. And the reason the way I pulled these big 5 is, how many of you are familiar with McKinsey? Big kind of global projecting firm, all right? A few of you are. So McKinsey has projected that the top changes that are going to impact the macro global economic structure in about the next 5 years, all right? The first is, and I've got them in range just simply from a economic standpoint, mobile internet and big data, 19 trillion projected per year by the year 2025. So when you think about where you want to invest, jobs, right, you may want to write that down, all right? But this expansion into the world and what can be done through that is incredibly important. Advanced robotics, AI, you've probably even seen the AI commercials on TV. The big international summit for experiential ed in Montreal this fall, I'm speaking on AI at that conference because even in the education space, we're starting to wonder what's going on, what does this mean? You've got robotic AI-based teachers in South Korea right now, so what's going to happen? I mean, where you've maybe seen this is some of you are maybe even driving some cars right now with some AI components inside of them, but this is a $6 trillion business in 2025. We're going to spend a lot of time getting into the details of what's going on with genomics, because that's really kind of the topic. But everything from low-cost, fast gene sequencing, PDGX, which is a company based in Baltimore, you can now get your genome sequenced for $1,000. All right. When the human genome was mapped in 2003, this was a result of 13 years of work that cost about $3 billion. All right. So IBM is almost done with a sequencing machine that can do the sequencing in under 60 minutes at a cost of about $90. All right. We are super close to having Pandora's box literally in everybody's house. All right. If that's what you want. Synthetic bio, so this is now the ability to write DNA, all right? So to actually create things like transgenic species. I was speaking out at a symposium a few years ago outside Boston, and one of the central questions was that there was a lab that had produced a goat that was 1/3 human and 2/3 goat. And the question, this is what nerdy people like me do on weekends, all right, was at what point does the goat get rights, all right? 51% human and 49% goat. I mean, where do you draw the line once you're now creating these hybrid species? And then gene drives, this is how we're going to get rid of mosquitoes if the state of Florida ever allows us to do it, all right? Obviously, if you're following the news, all right, last year when we had the Zika virus outbreak in Florida, now that you can actually manipulate gene drives and program whole species for extinction, the ability to get rid of things like mosquitoes. I'm not saying we should do that. Apparently there are some environmental consequences. But we can do it now. I think the 1.5 trillion in annual revenue that McKinsey's predicting is way, way beneath where this could eventually wind up. Power, of course, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but solar is finally actually becoming a true possibility. So there's a lot of thinking going on here. Advanced materials. This rounds out the big five, all right? And again, I think McKinsey is grossly underestimating what this could potentially be. And so this is the environment in which we live. Technology is moving very fast. There is significant capital at play, all right, which is making it move faster and faster and faster. And the moral philosophy is just simply not keeping up. The central concern that I want to focus on tonight is just the basic question is, what is a human being? All right. I was speaking on some emerging career trajectories at Stanford a couple years ago, and one of the subjects that came up that we spent a lot of time on was cloning, human cloning, because this was the big successful somatic cell nuclear transfer that was finally performed on human material in 2013 successfully. All right. So it's no longer theory. Possibility has been proven in a lab. Now again, 98% of clones that we've done with animals basically die after birth or at some point in the gestation period. So that still has to be solved, but this was a big debate. And in a room of 250 people, of supposedly the best and brightest people from all around the US and around the world, I could not find a single person in the crowd who was willing to stand up with me on the argument that if human clones were to exist, they should be afforded the same natural rights that the master copies have. And so that gives you a sense, and I'm sure there were people who agreed with me, but sensing the tone in the room, were unwilling to get stoned on their way back to their residence hall, all right? But that gives you a sense on kind of where the mentality is at right now as we think about some of these issues. So this is a quote from Snyder's book, Snyder from Stanford, and when we talk about prenatal genomic sequencing, all right, there is a group of doctors at Stanford right now who are arguing that it's not just simply about eye color, height, setting your kid up for speed, perfect vision, which all that can be done right now, all right? But there's an argument now that you can actually, they claim, all right, you can actually sequence the genes for behavior now. And so the ability, all right, to produce pre-screened children so that you get the ideal kid and potentially the ideal population. It's really fascinating when you read how Snyder develops this, and he's got one chapter in his book that's 3.5 pages long called Genomic Ethics or something like that. And the language he uses is the elimination of diseased children, all right? And that word elimination, all right, if you've ever read Mein Kampf, it should remind you of the same arguments that were being posed in that text, all right? And so we have this really incredible capability now to create pre-screened, disease-free designer children. And the only fault that Snyder finds in this is that if you create too many pre-screened kids, are you creating kids who will be more susceptible to some disease we don't know about, all right? Additionally, on the AI side, and this is Mueller's a big paper that came out with the release last month from Oxford, which the paper is called The Rise of Robots and the Law of Humans, which if you're looking for a quick read on what's going to happen in legal theory based on this, it's a fantastic read. But the thing that stuck out to me is, he writes, if the structure of society is utilitarian, and it is, all right, smart robots should, in the not too distant future, be treated like humans. That means that they should be accorded legal personality, have the power to acquire and hold property, and to conclude contracts. The case against treating robots like humans rests on epistemological and ontological arguments. These relate to whether machines can think. He argues that they cannot. And then, this is the important question, what it means to be human. The generation of kids right now, basically in 5th grade through college, in the next 10 to 15 years will redefine the term human being. All right, we can't define it right now. All right, even if you talk to the Nobel Prize winners at the New York Academy of Science, or if you go to talk to the deans at X college, there's a huge debate over what a human being actually is. All right, it is time to get back in the game and redefine what human being is from a biblical anthropological standpoint. Right, or we risk the lives of literally billions of people when we think about what we can now do with the technology that sits at our fingertips. So this is one of my favorite Machen quotes. Machen was a theologian at Princeton back at the start of the 20th century. And he argued that false ideas are the greatest obstacles to the reception of the gospel. We may preach with all the fervor of a reformer and yet succeed only in winning a straggler here and there if we permit the whole collective thought of the nation to be controlled by ideas which prevent Christianity from being regarded as anything more than a harmless delusion. All right, Machen wrote that just over a century ago, and it could very well be said of this is where we're at today. All right, yes, there are aspects of Christendom that continue to manifest themselves about us in the American culture in Western Europe, etc. But I can tell you from my own personal experience in working with labs, research institutions, working on the Hill, etc., they have little to no purchase on the intellectual, moral, and ethical society of our day today, all right? And so this is why my basic argument, and I realize there's this book out there called The Benedictine Option, all right, where we should go back into the woods, all right? Now is not the time to go to the woods. Now is the time to go back to the public square. And we'll talk about some steps to do that. So I call this my view from 30,000 feet because I spent a lot of time on planes, and I've been doing a lot of research on this whole issue of what has happened to the church specifically in about the last 10 to 15 years, but really in kind of the last century. Where have we gone? What are we doing? All right. Why is the next generation leaving the church in floods? All right. And there seems to me to be really kind of 5 major things going on. First of all, the cultural social structure replacement has gradually been changed out in about the last 10 to 15 years. All right, the Obergefell decision, which was handed down just a couple years ago, yes, I get it. It has to do with gay marriage. But when you really read the decision, all right, what that decision did is it legally, fundamentally changed what is the nature of society. How do we structure society? What is a father? What is a mother? What is a family? Those terms now have new definitions, all right? So this is a world in which we live now. Social norms, all right? When you look at what's going on with the gender/sex debates right now, there's just one example of the social norms that is certainly eroding as we look at not just the U.S., but Western Europe, etc. Specialization. We have a church today that I think the specialization and the technology of our society continues to reinforce on a daily basis that revelation is generally irrelevant for the living of daily life. Now, that may not be the case with the people in this room, all right, but largely speaking, we are constantly reminded every day that we live in a disenchanted, magic-free world, all right? I'm not here to say it needs to be magic, all right? But we live in a world where everything has material explanation, everything has a basic material functional cause, and we have completely disenchanted ourselves away from the truth, theologically informed, theologically driven worldview. On the intellectual irrelevance side, Mark Knoll wrote a famous book in 1993 called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And in the first page of the preface, he defined it as, and I quote, "The scandal of the evangelical mind is that there isn't much of one." All right? And the world that we are living in today is the direct result. Mark Knoll was right. And we have a movement that is largely intellectually bankrupt right now. The reason why I have a hard time finding Christians in these spaces is because we're not producing them. All right? And so we've got to get back in the game on this space. And kind of the most recent thing that we've seen come about in just the last couple years is because of these other 4 points, faith is now being redefined as discrimination. All right? If you hold on to a biblical mandate, if you hold on to faith, all right, you are actually discriminating against people who are different from those beliefs. And this creates really thorny issues in the public square. What we have done for this, or our current response seems to be that our pews are retreating further and further from the public square. I think Dreyer's book is a perfect example of where some of the mindset's at. But on the pulpit side, our pulpits seem to be trading principles for platforms, all right? And so what we need to create very quickly is we need to create like the Constitution of Christianity, right? And this is the biblical worldview for X point, and you have to believe in these things rather than teaching our kids to think, all right? You can give them the list of whatever you want them to believe that says that they're a Christian, and I guarantee you they'll become one of the statistics that if you believe the Barna statistics, roughly about 83% of them will leave the faith by their second year in college, all right? So teaching them to think is the key, and what that really begins with is logic, and we'll talk about this at the end. And Nolan, you want to hold up the book. The best book, this is a book that I used to use with my students when I taught logic, is Peter Kreft's book called Socratic Logic, all right? This is the best book on logic. If you got a kid that's about to go to college, this is the book they need. Make them read it, all right? So this becomes a very, very important piece in teaching our kids to think rather than just giving them lists of things to believe. And don't get me wrong, I'm all about the Westminster Confession and all these lists, all right? I think they're important. They frame it. But if we don't provide the critical thinking that's necessary for the age in which we live, we are sacrificing them on the altar of expediency. So let's get into a little bit detail on the bioethics. And we're going to talk about a lot of very specific things, but what I want to say to you is the lab is passed, all right? Most of the speaking I do is in the secular environment, but I got invited to speak to a pastor's conference a couple years ago, and on this kind of general topic, and it was stunned silence. It was like no one knew that some of these things were going on. The lab work is done and gone. It's out the door, all right? Genomics, cloning, all that stuff, gone, done, all right? Clinical trials are where we're at right now. That's why all of these companies are raising venture capital to do the clinical trials, all right? They're not raising venture capital so they can build labs, all right? That's not how it works. And so the clinical trials are where we're at right now, and then adoption, depending on what lab wins, adoption is where the future's at. And so we need to put a check by box one. You know, the sci-fi period's past. We're in a very different world right now when it comes to the investment landscape. So CPET, Nigel's group, even though this statement's dated, I think it's important to recognize that what we are dealing with is emerging technologies that will radically reshape the future of human society. All right, and I can't underestimate, all right, what this means. To be in labs at Stanford, for example, where there's mice running around that are 1/3 human. What do you do about that? All right, should we be doing that? All right, I get the reasons why it's important, all right, based on all the kind of testing you can do. But should we be manipulating the genetic material in that period? I want to spend time focusing in a little bit deeper on 4 things. So when we talk about bioethics, it's much broader. You could do 2 full semesters on this and probably not cover it. But anthropological confusion, all right? What is a human being, all right? I picked these 4 because these are the 4 that directly addresses. So we're going to talk about the Human Genome Project, human cloning, stem cell technology, and the neuro side. So let's start with the human genome. So for those of you who may not be familiar what this was officially mapped in 2003. It's basically, all right, you've got 20 to 25,000 genes that make up the genome, and this genetic information is like the code to making humans, all right? If you've seen Jurassic Park, all right, you know, where you make the dinosaurs, which, by the way, there's a new company that's going to do that now. But this is essentially what we're talking about, that you have the genetic material, the genetic code to build potentially the human you want, but more precisely, at least right now, to at least edit out and correct the human that you want right now. So who here is a 23andMe member? Nobody? I'm not it. Oh yeah? All right, okay. So your genetic material, by the way, was just sold to Genentech for $60 million. But This is one of the big companies. They were hit by a lawsuit a couple years ago by the federal government, and so all of their kind of health concepts have been removed. But 23andMe, you spit in a cup, you mail it in, all right? You don't get a full genetic profile from that, but you get a partial. And what 23andMe has done is they're selling that information. Genentech is a big pharma company. And so imagine getting insights into 900,000 people in terms of what their potential disease factors are. You can build the pills potentially that those people are going to need. But there's lots of questions about privacy here. All right, so once your genetic code is mapped, and 23andMe is not giving a complete map, but if you drive up the road to PDGX, you pay $1,000 and you get your code mapped, who owns that information? Because who would love to have your genetic profile? Your health insurance company would love to have this information, all right? Do you have the gene that's prone for cancer or not, right? And, so there's genetic privacy. I think on the testing side, there's a big debate that we need to get in the game on is when should genetic testing be permissible? All right, so this is beyond the issue of when should you be allowed to make genetic testing or prenatal testing based decisions, all right? So if your wife is pregnant and you want somebody that's 6'5" for a kid who can run really fast and has blonde hair and blue eyes, at what point should you be allowed to no longer edit or mess with that genetic material, or in some case, and I think most of us would probably land on a pro-life side, but what Snyder and others are wrestling with is, does there need to be a boundary in terms of when you can terminate or not terminate, or should you be forced to terminate based on certain genetic profiles, right? If we want to weed out certain types of the population. So all this genetic testing, I think, is really important, and we need to form a clear position on where, as Christians, we want to stand on that. On the therapy side, all right, repairing existing genetic material, all right, and most of the debate here is on the prenatal side, all right? So if we know that we have a concern for a disease factor, all right, should we alter the genes of the individual, what we call somatic cell gene therapy, or should you perform the newer technology, which is germline, which allows you to not only remove that tendency or that gene sequence from that individual, but also removes it from all progeny that may come from that person, all right? So you're altering not just one potential being, but all other potential beings that may come from that original being, all right? And so having positions on where do we stand on these types of things is going to be very important as we think about what's going on in genomics. The big things are what's hot. So the ability to map gene drives and to edit those gene drives, all right? This was the whole issue in Florida, which the state of Florida decided not to do. Basically, you would manipulate the gene drive of several million mosquitoes, pre-program them for extinction, release them into the skies of Florida. They would mate with the mosquitoes that have the Zika virus, but they would also pass on that genetic defect that would basically pre-program the species for mosquitoes. No mosquitoes in Florida. Sounds pretty cool. But the environmentalists had some problems with that plan. But here, when you think about what you can do with this, all right, there are huge implications when you think about what you could do with this with humans, what you could do with this to control other species, invasive species, plants. I don't know if you guys caught, I was down in Virginia Beach with my family this weekend, and I flipped on National Geographic Channel, and there was a whole special on genetically modified foods. And what they're doing is they're actually moving to a gene edit-based phase now because they think that the general public will like that better. So we're not just talking about human beings, we're talking about plants here as well in terms of what you might potentially do. And again, we need to figure out where we stand on this stuff. Xenotransplantation, so synthetic genomics, all right, is actually one of Craig's companies that he founded in 2014. They're actually conducting work on lungs, hearts, kidneys, and livers, primarily in pigs. But what you're doing is you're creating a transgenic species, basically, because you're creating a human organ inside the host species, and then allows you to harvest that. Of course, if they got your genetic profile, you can build that organ to your specifications. If this works out, I mean, you potentially have solved the organ donor crisis. Just to give you a sense on how close they are, one of their competitors, eGenesis, just in March, ran a successful $38 million private venture fundraising campaign, all right? So they have $38 million to conduct their test phase, basically, in terms of making this work. So xenotransplantation is kind of one of the hot topics right now. There's a lot going on in that space in just the last 12 months alone. Longevity and reversing extinction. So another company that Craig founded, Human Longevity, they actually just raised $70 million in venture capital. And what they're working on is there a way to modify the human genome so that you can prolong life extensively. One of the goals that they've set is to take basically double so that you go from a life expectancy in the 75 to 90 range and bump that up to about 150, all right? I'm not sure my knees could hold up, but maybe there's a way. Craig's a very smart guy, but they're doing a lot of work. And of course, some of the lab work required to do some of these things would certainly be questionable from a religious standpoint as well in terms of what you need to do this. Revive and Restore, which was founded in 2012, they're using advanced genomics to bring extinct animals back to life. You probably heard about the big successful test a couple years ago where the bucadero, which is a mountain goat in South America that's been extinct for a while, they were able to retrieve DNA, rebuild the genome. They implanted that into a modern goat. I don't know what kind of goat it was, but they successfully brought it to term. It gave birth to it. It did die within a few hours, which is fairly typical with a lung defect. But the ability to actually get that created all kinds of incredible news that a bucadero had actually been brought back into existence. There are 3 projects that Revive and Restore is working on right now. One is the carrier pigeon. They claim they're getting close, so maybe the carrier pigeon comes back. Not sure why that would be the animal you would pick. And then there's some type of South American tree frog that's been extinct for a while. So we'll see where they get to. But there are reasons why some of these animals went extinct, and are we playing God by trying to bring this stuff back, and what's next? But the main point is the technology exists, right? You can do this. It's not extremely successful technology. You got about a 98% fail rate here. But this is kind of where the technology is when we think about that. Moving on to cloning. So cloning, I don't know if you saw the Scarlett Johansson, The Island movie, all right? You may have seen this. I mean, we're still, truthfully, probably a long ways away. There were a couple scandals in the last 10 years. Supposedly 2 different labs in South Korea had cloned humans. I have no doubt that the BGI, the Beijing Genomic Institute, has a secret lab someplace where they're doing this stuff. The Chinese have fewer rules than we do per se, but the big news, all right, was Metalopov's work. So in 2007, you probably heard about Metalopov's work with the Remus monkey, where they successfully cloned an embryonic sample. Finally, in 2013, they actually succeeded with a human sample, all right? So you have the scientific theory. Now you have an embryonic sample that actually can be created. The sample was not taken to term in the lab. And so we are kind of at the phase right now where at what point do we actually start applying this? You still have about 50 countries around the world that have signed off on no cloning laws. And I think depending on where the trajectory goes, probably led by the Chinese at this point, will largely determine where we go from here. I think some of the big questions when we talk about human cloning is the purpose. Why do it? All right. I was speaking at a seminary once on the moral philosophy around cloning, and we got into a big debate as to whether the clones have souls or not, all right? And there was a well-informed group of students who was arguing pervasively that the clones would be second-class citizens because they don't have souls, all right? And I mean, to some extent, I guess you could find a basis in Augustine, for example. One of the reasons why Augustine supported abortion is because Augustine argued that the soul does not inhere in the human person until it's halfway through the birth canal. I'm not sure how Augustine knew that, all right? But you can see where the argument basis is here. Do clones have souls or not? And apparently only humans with souls have value. And I mean, how you figure that out, but this is an important debate. Legal responsibility. Who or what would be legally responsible for a clone? And you've got inherent language there about what does this mean? And so we've got to figure out some of this stuff. And I know we're running short on time, so I'm going to kind of skip ahead. But there's just a lot of really big, juicy questions about, well, should we even be doing this, all right? Because I fear we're getting to a point like the island where this would be some type of second-class human being. Stem cells is kind of an old topic, so I'll kind of skip that for now. It's just important to make sure you make the distinction whether we're talking about embryonic, or if you're doing embryonic stem cell work, you are killing a living embryo, versus non-embryonic or adult stem cells. Neuroscience, so this is a poster from a recent talk in Germany, in Frankfurt, that Singer gave. We already actually have a lot of neuro things that are on the market right now for public consumption. So especially in kind of the sexual activity market, your enhancement, arousal, various things that are used there. Jim and I have spent a lot of time talking about the morality of truth serums, all right? So the ability to mess with the human brain to make people tell the truth, which could completely revolutionize our legal system in this country, maybe even some of the people running for the presidency. But weaponization of neuroscience, and this is some of the really interesting stuff that Jim's been doing with the Pentagon, and he talks about some of this in his interview with Nigel on the CPET site. But the ability to, and Jim claims it can be done, but to control and direct thinking remotely could be a valuable asset in battle. But again, we get into huge thorny issues of should we do this? Are you affecting personhood, free will, privacy? I mean, there's lots of things that make us wonder, where do we stand on this? What is the Christian perspective on neuroscience, neuroethics, et cetera? So I want to hit taking action just quickly, and I'm going to go through this, but I want to talk about Matthew 5. Matthew 5 is the passage where Christians are called to be salt and light. And so as we think about where the game is at in the US and Europe and Asia right now on this topic, this isn't simply about choosing to get in the game. I think we are obligated, we are divinely commissioned to get back into the game here. On the salt side, all right, we must preserve, most importantly, a well-argued and well-defended biblical anthropology. The moral direction of our culture ultimately depends on what we are. And I think this is the biggest risk right now when you look at what's going on in the United States and Western Europe is, what will the definition of human being be in the next 10 to 15 years? Much hinges, the fate of billions hinge on where that will be defined. And I notice there are some young people here tonight, and so we need you in the game, all right? My daughter, who's a sophomore, told me a few months ago that one of the things she's really interested in is biomedical engineering. And I said, that's a great field. God needs warriors in that field, probably more than some fields, but that will be intense, all right? This is going to be the front line of battle in the next 5 to 10 years, and we need to arm up and get some people on that line. On the light side, we have to proclaim truth, which is, of course, proclaiming Christ, but I think it's more than that. It's bringing the light of truth to every aspect in public culture. I don't buy into this notion that we once had a Christian society and now we don't, all right? I feel like maybe in terms of the time period right now, we're in like the Empire Strikes Back, right? But the Return of the Jedi comes next. And you've got this constant flux, right? You'd never really had a Christian society, all right? But you had the powers of darkness and sin, and the only agent of moral truth commissioned on this planet by God himself was the church. And as the church acts as that salt and light, it is holding back the darkness. And so when our light goes dim, the darkness advances. And so this is kind of, I think, what Matthew 5 is basically talking about. These are the first steps I think that we need to take. As Romans 12 argues, step one, we have to renew the mind. Once we renew the mind, I think we can restore the family and reform the church and then revitalize the culture. We can never truly revitalize the culture. I'm not here defending some type of post-millennial argument that we need to Christianize society, all right? I don't think that is possible. The issue here is what is going to be the intensity of the light. How many of the bad arguments are we going to refute until Christ comes back? All right, but this is the model that I think Scripture lays out in terms of where we need to go. So if you're here tonight and you're saying, put me in, coach, I need to go to the public square, where is this thing, all right? Well, we've got to start here with renewing the mind first. I think the way we do that is, number one, we have to get back to the source, all right? High Christology, the ecclesiastical mission, a true understanding of what it means to be salt and light in this day and age. And then once we have that, we've got to get back to the sources. I teach Western philosophy at Northern Virginia Community College, which is probably like the last course those kids need, all right? But I had a kid this spring semester who approached me after the first day of class, and I don't call it a testimony, but I share a little bit of my story on the first night. And he said, I don't understand, you're a Christian who's teaching philosophy. And I said, what do you not get with that? He goes, well, philosophy is dangerous to Christianity. I don't know where these kids are getting this stuff, all right? But we have to get back to the sources: logic, rhetoric, ethics, philosophy, at least the big five, all right? Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Cicero, Aquinas. This should be mandatory discussion, mandatory reading as we look to raise our kids to develop the way of thinking. If you're looking for one quick textbook, Moreland and Craig got a massive tome called Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. I highly recommend it. My philosophy students that used to make it through, they would all receive a copy of that book. And it's a way about thinking about how you can arm yourself to argue for some of these things that are going on today. And I think once we can check those boxes, we're going to have a group of people that can actually weigh in on the greatest debate of our day, which is, what is a human being? And it's not just simply about human being and defining that term, but our issues on personhood, sexuality, marriage, social structure, origin, all of it hinges on that, all right? If we get a definition which pushes us out, clouds us out, we're going to be in a tough spot, all right? And so I think if there's one message that I have for you, get smart on this, talk to your kids about this. There's a lot going on, and the church has to reemerge as an authoritative speaker. I'm not saying we're going to win, but the argument has to get back in the public square. So I think Tom wants to take some questions, and I'll do my best to address them.
Well, thank you, Andrew. It's been we thought we would start after some ice cream with a light topic, and just thank you. Gifting. And I should have mentioned as we started that we are live streaming this worldwide right now. But I will also tell you that we started it after you had your second bowl of ice cream. So your wife was not watching you going, I saw that. So we started it at 7:30 tonight. We'd like to open up the floor for about 20 minutes for questions. I'll be kind of serve as a moderator. I ask you to ask a question, not make a statement. We have a speaker already. So who will be first? Yes, sir. Why don't you stand and shout out? I don't have a microphone for you, so.
Yes, thank you very much. That was a very enlightening presentation. A little over 20 years ago, Sir John Templeton formed a foundation to do research on religion, noting at the time that billions were spent for research every day, and when it came to religion, you were stuck with pronouncements about 2,000 years old. So thought that gap needed to be bridged. I don't know if they're dealing with things like this, but it causes me to wonder, why couldn't you try to develop an ethical template, get some very thoughtful, spiritually minded folks together, figure out how to do this, and you plug in whatever technology advancement you're talking about. You go down a sort of a decision tree, where if it's going to lead to something negative, and you need to put constraints on it, it's going to lead to something that's ambivalent, could go both ways, then maybe you need to circumscribe it somehow. Or if it's going to lead to something positive, how do you encourage it? Couldn't you? It just seems like there's such a hodgepodge of things out there to try to deal with, that you really need some way to kind of.
Let's see if Andrew can answer that. Can you just summarize the question if you understood it?
Yeah.
Yes, everybody could hear it.
So I think the question was, is there an existing system, or could one be developed that allows you to push a lot of these dynamic and new concepts through almost a sieve that would say good, bad, right? Yeah. And so some of these things do exist, right? Trinity International has kind of their own sieve. It's a little bit dated. William Lane Craig and J.P. Morgan have actually done some thinking on some of this stuff, so you can find some of their work there. I think the reason why you don't have something that is systematic and embraced is I think in some sense we've kind of turned a deaf ear, because it's like we don't want to deal with it. We know stuff is going on, but it sounds too crazy. And so, rarely will you find some of these topics being addressed formally directly in pulpit, pew, et cetera. I think this is probably a rare exception that you have a topic like this being discussed in this environment inside a church today. So yeah, there are models that exist, but nothing systematic yet. I mean, you would be hard-pressed to find a complete bioethics textbook written from a Christian perspective, and partially because the game changes every month. I mean, the new technology that crops up.
Good. Okay. Nice and loud. Stand up, shout it out.
You mentioned the revive and restore example of goat. Are they doing that with, Neanderthal or?
So there is no focus on humans right now. It's completely focused on animal-based species. And their failure rate's huge. I mean, it's going to take them a while before they get a successful creation done.
And then a quick follow-up. How long have they been mixing, or what year is it official that they've been mixing human and animal?
Well, so the human genome was mapped in 2003. Most of your genomics-based labs are really a relic of maybe the last 5 to 7 years at most. So you have some transgenic work that maybe began as early as 2009, but probably not more than 5 or 6 years. This is relatively recent, and the success stories are super recent.
Other questions? Yes, sir. Can you stand up, Scott, and nice and loud?
So this is more personal for you to answer, but when you went through graduate school, and you had your Christian friends and your non-Christian friends, you kept on mentioning the Christians we're not in the game anymore. So from your own perspective, from your own experience, as you interacted with your Christian friends, what were some of the things that were going on with them? Why weren't they in the game with you?
Okay, so why are Christians, why does Andrew not feel that Christians are still in the game anymore?
From a
Personal perspective, okay.
Yeah, I mean, so from a personal perspective for me, I mean, I think, my statement that Christians aren't in the game is set at a macro level. I mean, there are still, to quote Kings, the 5,000 who have not bowed the knee, right? I am sure that we have very skilled, Stephen Barr comes to mind as a leading astrophysicist who, is strongly defending a Christian viewpoint in cosmology and string theory, et cetera. But when you look at the masses and, when I'm working with deans, provosts, et cetera, the mixers in New York, I mean, they're just not there. To me, I think there is and this is kind of what I've been studying, and someday maybe the book will come out if I actually have time to write it, but I've been collecting the notes on what happened. I don't know if you're familiar with Nancy Pearcey's book, Total Truth. Mm-hmm. Nancy Pearcey did a really nice job of trying to chronicle kind of what took place. Mm-hmm. And so to spare you kind of a big historical story, Nancy Pearcey kind of paints the backdrop. And I really think where my research is taking me is my generation largely grew up in an environment where we really didn't see the relevance of revelation for our daily lives. Religion was a private matter. It's something that we discussed at home and maybe with your parents, but in terms of it really publicly informing the way I'm supposed to eat, think, drink, live, drive my car, etc., not real. And so there was a macro level shift that I think my generation, maybe the one before me, kind of went through as we came into the 80s and the 90s and all the new stuff that the world presented. So to me, I think that's the fundamental source, and so there wasn't a reason to do this. And I think also on the academic level, to be a evangelical does not carry a lot of respect currently. My philosophy professor, when I was doing my work in classics, we used to hang out and just talk philosophy when class was done. And so I got this question one night of, well, Andrew, are you religious? I was like, well, yeah. And he's like, well, what's your religion? And so my safe play was evangelical. That was the wrong response. Mm-hmm. And so I think there is the secular environment is antagonistic to this way of thinking, and in some sense justified. I think some of the research we produce is not that hot.
Mm-hmm. Who else? Other questions? Yes, sir.
I get the impression that in order to dabble in this, you need to be either a nation state or a very wealthy company. And so far, most of your speech dealt on the positive side of this stuff. how much of a buy-in would a terrorist organization, how big would it have to be in order to start making these DNA engines or gene engines, to start manipulating things that could actually harm people for a large population?
Yeah, I mean, so the question was about, can you buy a genome sequencing machine? Is that kind of the question? Yeah, I mean, the big box machines that are fast, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? The smaller machines, and you've got desktop size sequencing machines, those can be bought for tens of thousands now. So I think it's access to the genetic material that you need, even more importantly than the machines per se. But I'm not really sure what a terrorist would do. I mean, unless they get to the point where they could weaponize neuroscience, maybe. But I think there's a lot of stuff, even though my friend Jim is the authority on this, and I still don't quite get how you do that. But yeah, I think we're probably a long ways away from that. But yeah, sure, it's possible.
Any other questions? Yes. Nice and loud, Dave.
Well, this is extremely interesting to me, but it appears to be all on a very academic level. So my question is, we as laymen, what can we do?
So the question is what can laymen do? So I'll give you one specific example. My father is a VP or something at a seminary down in North Carolina called Shepherd's Theological Seminary. And so I went to him about a year ago and I said, Dad, we got to do something, because the meetings I'm sitting in at Stanford, Harvard, whatever it might be, like this train is off the tracks big time. And I said, one, can we start requiring courses like philosophy, logic, et cetera, as part of the ministerial training process? But also getting these guys really thinking about these things. And of course, to do that kind of stuff, you need cash, right? And so my dad created a way for businessmen like myself to fund the seminary, all right? And it's called the Association of Friends. But I think finding our talents like that, whether it's guys that are in seminary right now who are going to be the guys standing in the pulpit, finding our talented kids that are going through our schools, et cetera, that want to serve God by studying whatever field it might be, actually getting behind those kids and that next generation to actually make sure that they make it. All right, so if we've got a top-notch kid who's a potential Blagojevich scholar or something like that in sciences, the church needs to surround that kid, support and protect him, give him the funding they need. And I think the same thing on the ministerial side. I mean, the landscape for ministers in the next 10 to 15 to 20 years, when you look at it strategically, it's going to be tough. And if we've got guys who are committed, who've been called by God, let's make it work for them. So I think that's just one tangible way where you don't even have to get into the academic mess here, but you can support the next generation of leaders, both in the pulpit and the pew, that we're going to need in these fields.
Anybody else?
You referenced a book, A Brave New World. And now I'm glad my junior college philosophy professor made me read that book. But what I wanted to ask you was, do you see this as just a bunch of very smart people doing this because they can, kind of blundering through it, or saying, hey, we can do this, now let's do it? Or is this orchestrated and engineered with an end in mind?
So I think the question is when you look at these labs and you talk to these faculty, is there a clear end in mind, or is it just kind of accidental? I think there's a little bit of both. There's as much confusion on the secular side of the coin as I think there is on the Christian side of the coin here. The top-notch scientific minds, while there's definitely a goal that they're trying to get to, they're very focused on kind of the clinical trials, all right? They're really not thinking through what are the implications of X, Y, and Z. Now, there are some that are, and Craig Venter would be one example. But most of the academics are head down inside the lab seeing what's going to happen from the next sequence, right? So I think this is why I think there is really great opportunity right now when we think about making sure the argument from a biblical anthropological standpoint is there. Because a lot of these people are, when you go to these mixers, some of the conversations you had is, this is kind of what we're doing in the lab, and it feels weird, right? And so, I'm not sure there is this grand strategy of what they're going to do. There's very few people that think like that. It's all about the technology, what's cool today, And we're not really thinking through what this means. I mean, President Trump has not launched a new council on bioethics yet, but the old council that Obama put together significantly shifted where Bush was at. From the Bush council was more of a philosophical council. The Obama council was more utilitarian. I think depending on where the next council goes, that might provide some guide rails for where the scientific community, at least in this country, is supposed to work.
Yeah, Bob, this will be the last question.
Thank you. Did I hear correctly that so much of this is privately funded or funded by private corporations, not federally funded, apart from China or whatever? And if that's the case, wouldn't there be a profit motive downstream or something like that?
Oh yeah, so a lot of the dollars in the U.S. right now are actually being raised through private capital venture campaigns, because there's enough lab work that's been proven out to be successful now that the clinical trials could be successful. So imagine if you can solve the organ donor crisis, or if you can pre-program out cancer, or whatever those things might be. I mean, this is a multi-trillion-dollar concept. And so there's a lot of investment dollars flocking. I mean, when I was at the New York Academy of Science event a few weeks ago, my big disappointment was Mark Messier did not show. That was the main reason why I went. But a few people who didn't show actually called in, and they were dropping like $250,000 as like an apology for not showing, right? The type of money that's flowing through the research side here is truly unbelievable. And if you've not been to a top research institution in the last few years, take a look at what some of these genomic labs look like. Look at their sequencing machines. I mean, this is, you're going to feel like you've stepped into like a high-tech sci-fi movie. I mean, it's pretty amazing the capital that's currently flowing around this stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of cash to be made.
So my follow-up question then is, let's suppose that we have this fellow or woman who grows up and she's this brilliant scientist, has a tremendous worldview from a Christian point of view. How would she stand against this tidal wave of profit, given that they might be successful? Do you understand my question? Mm-hmm. It seems like the opposition would be so difficult to stand against on a moral ground.
Yeah, well, I think Paul says something in Romans 8 about who's standing with us.
Is he a pastor? I was just wondering.
But to me, yeah, it's going to be a tough road. For the young kids who are thinking about careers in biomedical engineering and genomics, whatever it might be, it's going to be a tough road. Your faith is going to be tested. There's going to be a lot of things going on inside that lab that you might philosophically disagree with, but the voice needs to be there. I've been very impressed with some of the humility of some of the people that I've worked with in this space in terms of they're truly searching for like, should we be doing this? And a lot of times there are very few people in that lab counseling restraint. And so, yes, it will be tough. There will be probably casualties that we will take with the kids that we send into this, but the voice needs to be heard.
Great. Well, Andrew, we want to thank you. Please, men, help join me. It's been a great interaction on hear about things that are right in front of us that you and I need to be not only aware of, but as Andrew reminded us, developing this biblical worldview and being able to not run from the public square, but be in the center of it with the right answers. And as he mentioned from Romans 8, we know whose side God is on, and so we'd be encouraged by that. Men, we're about to close. Let me encourage you to bring your significant other with you a month from tonight. We will meet back here at 7 p.m. again for robust ice cream sundaes and also a interaction with a discussion about global warming, fact or fiction. So with that, let me close in a word of prayer and thank you all for being with us. So let's pray together. Father, it's been a good night to be together and to hear from one of your choice servants. And I thank you the way you have gifted Andrew and for not only his preparation, but his delivery tonight. And he's represented you well. And Lord, the challenge coming from Matthew 5 is indeed before us, that we are called to be salt and light. So Lord, I pray that we walk away, maybe not completely armed on the subject, but we understand that we have a responsibility to speak truth to those that desperately need to hear it, to speak for the unborn, to speak for life, your creation. So, Lord, we thank you that you encouraged us tonight through Andrew's presentation, and be with us as we go. Now, we pray this in Christ's name, and all God's men said, amen. Have a great night, guys. Thanks for coming.